And we have some folks virtually, and of course, here we have our audience live. My name is Francisco Lucio. I'm the Associate Dean for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the University of Arizona College of Medicine, Phoenix. Also Assistant Professor in the Department of OBGYN. We're going to talk to you today about COVID-19 and LHS plus disparities, highlighting the need for medical schools to consider accepting DACA recipients. This is a part of a talk that I've been giving at Listos, focused on DACA recipients, medical education, but I've sort of adjusted it a little bit in light of what's happened over the last couple of years. So like many of you, I was really struck by what was happening with the onset of the pandemic. And unlike you, I am not a medical doctor. I was not on the front lines, but of course I worked with folks who were. And I was listening to all of the news reports, just like everybody else was as well. And hearing the disparate impacts that we saw in the LHS plus community. And, that really got me to, think about, what is it that we're seeing here? How does that kind of converge with policy? And what are some of the things that we can be doing better to really alleviate some of these challenges that we're seeing with the impact of COVID, the high cases, the hospitalizations, the deaths. And this was very personal for me. Obviously, being from the LHS plus community, I'm Mexican. My parents are, when they were working, they were, immigrant farm workers. And so, they would have been deemed essential, folks in society. And a lot of my family, still really would have was captured in that kind of essential employee category during the pandemic. And so, thinking about the opportunity to really make a change, make an impact, I wanted to explore this avenue of policy, DACA, and medical education. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So this was a confluence of those different factors, right? COVID-19, those disparities that we saw with the impact of COVID-19, but also the disparities that we saw already in the LHS plus community. I know that there's sort of the paradox of LHS plus health in this country, but there are still a lot of disparities that we do see amongst the LHS plus communities. And of course, then there is this question of DACA. And sort of looking at these three different factors, in the middle, I saw, which is something that I think we all see and have seen, which is medical school admissions as the gatekeepers of who gets in and who doesn't get in, who has access, who doesn't have access, what will our physician workforce look like, and how does that impact the number of LHS plus physicians that we're going to see today and the ones that we're going to see tomorrow. So I wanted to start with just a timeline of DACA. And so this is something that has been, that started many, many years ago. In 2009, we had some legislators who identified a challenge for some of their constituents. There were some young people who were born in another country, but live here in the United States, were undocumented, but wanted to work and wanted to go to school. And there wasn't a mechanism in place for that to happen, for them to come out of the shadows to be able to do that. And so the idea of the DREAM Act was introduced to our legislature. Unfortunately, there wasn't the required votes to pass this, and that DREAM Act failed, really trying to target those individuals who had been born in another country, but pretty much raised their entire lives here in the United States, and or and we're seeking employment here or education in this country. In 2001, that happened. In 2009, there was the failure of those legislative votes. And then a number of years pass, and we have President Barack Obama, who comes into office, and one of the promises that he made was he wanted to have immigration reform, and he was frustrated with the lack of ability for Congress to send him something to his desk to be able to sign, and so he devised the policy of DACA, which stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This was executed, and essentially what this was a use of was called prosecutorial discretion. So the idea that government officials get the choice to decide, how do I use my limited resources? How am I going to use the limited resources? Am I going to use my limited resources in immigration to focus on this group or that group? And this was essentially that program that said, I'm going to defer to identify and deport and process individuals who sort of meet this criteria. And I'm going to focus on different folks in this pool. And then in 2014, President Obama tries to expand this to the parents of those children that and young people who were part of DACA. And there was a challenge to this. In 2014, 25 states sued to stop the expansion of DACA, and it was upheld by the court. So the court said you can't expand DACA to the parents of those children, and so no expansion of DACA. And then fast forward in 2017, obviously there was a lot of politicization of what we saw with immigration issues during the presidential election. President Trump comes into office, and of course, we all remember the build the wall promises and deportation promises. And so really an onslaught to the LHS plus community. And in 2017, President Trump rescinds DACA. This was a program that was created at the executive branch. He's the leader of the executive branch, and he said, we're going to rescind this program. And of course, that was met with swift legal challenges by folks in the LHS plus community and others. And it went to the court system. It was adjudicated, and the courts put an injunction on that rescission saying, no, wait, executive branch, you can't do this in the way that you're doing it. And then that was challenged, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court in 2019. That was heard by the Supreme Court in 2019. There was a decision that came out in 2020, and the court said the manner in which you tried to rescind this DACA program was illegal. It was unconstitutional. You can't do it the way that you had attempted to do it. And so that was the decision of the Supreme Court. Then in 2021, there was a new case, Texas versus the United States. And in that case, the judge found that actually the creation of DACA was in violation of the Constitution and therefore illegal. And we'll sort of get into a little bit more details of that, but that is the timeline of the origination of DACA and where we are today. So who was eligible for DACA? What were the parameters? There on the screen, we can see it was created for individuals under the age of 31 as of June 15th, 2012. folks who came to the United States before reaching their 16th birthday. Again, those folks who were brought here as children, having continually resided in the United States since 2007, were physically present in the US on June 15th, and were making their request for consideration of DACA. Had no lawful status, were currently in school, had graduated or obtained a certificate of completion from high school, had obtained a GED, et cetera, and had not been convicted of particular kinds of felonies, and were at least 15 when they were requesting DACA status. So we're talking about policies, and we're talking about parameters, but we're really talking about people, right? And so there are people who were, of course, impacted and still are impacted by the status that's conferred on them or not conferred on them as individuals, as human beings. And the AAMC really did a good job of capturing the stories of some individuals. Here we have Yasmin, who is a DACA recipient who talks about her, her path. And I just wanted to read a bit of an excerpt here. She says in the article, it says, Yasmin had no idea that she was undocumented. That is until her mother had a stroke. My sister and I were 16, so we thought we'll just go get jobs to help mom with the family expenses. Not only could Yasmin not work, but she couldn't get a driver's license and couldn't go to college. And then we have Cesar Montolongo, and in the article here, it expresses he didn't expect to go to college, but he scored well enough on the ACTs to earn a scholarship to New Mexico State University. He even took the MCAT exam and did well, but without papers, he was stuck. I wasn't going anywhere because I couldn't even leave the city. I kept thinking, do I give up and find another profession, or do I try to be a doctor? I decided I would rather dream and fail than not to try. Of course, the pursuit of medical education is fraught with a lot of hurdles, and this being a very challenging piece for young people navigating the system, and one that we have a responsibility to make easier for them. So where are DACA recipients from? DACA recipients come from all over the world, and it's a policy that is impactful for many, many individuals. But as you can see in the chart there, the vast majority of individuals who have been granted DACA status are DACA recipients. Over 800,000 have been from Latin American countries, and 79% of those are Mexican. And so, you can see those top states there, from Mexico to El Salvador to Guatemala, Honduras, Peru, Latin American countries, and then South Korea comes in there as a first non-Latin American country with 9,000 recipients. But the vast majority of folks LHS plus, and so very much so a policy that can either hurt or benefit the LHS plus community. And so we see a lot of impacts from individuals who are DACA recipients. New jobs and increased salaries once individuals become DACA recipients. There is opportunity for participation in licensing programs, increases in wages. Again, as soon as you are a recipient of a DACA status. And more than 5% of DACA recipients under the age of 25 have started a small business. Again, ability to come out of the shadows, ability to pursue entrepreneurship endeavors. 8% of dreamers over 25 years old are entrepreneurs, and about 24% of DACA recipients over the age of 25 have bought their first home. Again, we know that this is an entryway to building generational wealth and something that's really, really important. When we look at, what's been the impact on the health profession, on medicine, the AAMC in their amicus brief to the Supreme Court really outlined all the benefits that we have for DACA recipients in healthcare, in medicine. And there are about 200 medical students, medical residents, and physicians who are DACA recipients in sort of the pipeline and workforce. There are retained trainees and physicians will care for about 1.7 to 5.1 million patients throughout their careers. And so the impact over the life of a career for a DACA recipient, tremendous when we take these folks in aggregate. A large amount of time, effort, and money has been spent by health institutions to train individuals on expectations of future work. And it takes approximately $5 million to train a DACA medical resident. And so tearing down that policy, obviously a big financial impact to the investment that health institutions and systems have put into place. DACA recipients are most likely to work in medically underserved areas. And when we think about the pipeline, and so who's coming to knock at the door of our institutions to get into medical school, we have 188,000 DACA and DACA eligible students in colleges and universities today, a large group, and 65% of those are Latinx or LHS plus. And only 73 of the 150 plus allopathic medical schools accept DACA recipient students today. When we look, of course, at those disparities amongst the physician workforce, we know that only 5.8% of active physicians are LHS plus. Only 6.2% of medical students identified as LHS plus in 2018, 2019. Despite being almost 19% of the population in the United States. And so obviously a challenge there to reconcile that disparity. And again, in talking about that confluence of what we saw with the pandemic, we've seen these statistics before. The CDC reporting that LHS plus are 2.1 times more likely to die from COVID compared to whites. 2.5 times more likely to be hospitalized compared to whites, and 1.6 times more likely to contract COVID-19 compared to whites. So, these disparities are stark for the LHS plus community. And when we consider the opportunities to expand that workforce to be able to meet the needs of the LHS plus community, this seems like a mechanism that, we should be able to activate in order to address public health crisis that we're seeing in this country. So I mentioned the Texas v. United States case. This was again a direct challenge to the legality of DACA, and the court decision was that that creation of DACA was unlawful in violation of the Administrative Procedures Act, the APA, saying in part that the way that the policy was created, the program was created, was one that skirted the rules of how you have to do it properly. But that case, that judge ordered that although the finding was that the policy was unconstitutional, that the program could continue in its for current recipients, including renewals. So every 2 years, DACA recipients have to apply to renew this status. The court said you can go ahead and continue to maintain your status if you have it, and you can also renew if you have it. There would be new applications that were accepted. So somebody who was waiting to apply for DACA status could put in an application, but the government was prohibited from processing those renewals. And so obviously you can imagine a huge backlog of applications in the sort of bureaucratic system that might exist today. The Biden administration has appealed to the Fifth Circuit this court ruling, and that court could issue a ruling that supersedes that Texas case and overturns it. When President Biden came into his administration, he directed the Secretary of Homeland Security to take all actions that they deemed appropriate, consistent with applicable law, to preserve and fortify DACA. Again, we've seen this in the political rhetoric that there is a support by this administration to fortify DACA, to really target these individuals and have some immigration reform. But as everybody obviously also is aware, that political landscape from the time that the president came into office to now has really changed dramatically. There are a lot of things that are happening around the world. And as it goes sort of in the political world, sometimes priorities change, and this seems to have been one of them. But what do we see from public opinion? We know that 83% of individuals favor immigrants who are brought to the U.S. illegally as children, quote unquote, the chance to become U.S. citizens if they meet certain requirements over a period of time. So on both sides of the aisle, bipartisan, there's a lot of support for this sort of cadre of folks who are here in the United States. There has been an enaction of the American Dream and Promise Act that was passed in the House in March of 2021 that addresses an opportunity for legal permanent residency for individuals who meet this criteria. And so that's one of the legislative mechanisms that has been enacted. It passed in the House. It's waiting to go to the Senate and go through that process right now. Obviously, the makeup of the Senate is really important. You're going to need 60 votes for something to pass and end debate to avoid a filibuster. Currently, as the Senate is made up, we would need 10 Republican senators, and we have a few sort of conservative Democrats who have been holdouts as well, and so would be impactful there as well. The Biden administration has issued DACA proposal in the Federal Register September 2021, pursuant to the APA to satisfy legal procedural rulemaking concerns. And so the administration recreated sort of the policy according to the rules and according to what the court had an objection to hopefully remedy the issue that that court and any future courts might have about how this program was created. And that's currently right now sort of in the sort of public notice portion in the Federal Register. And you could take a look at it. It's available right now online. And Congress should, could introduce a clarification for the Department of Homeland Security that it has authority to implement DACA. So another step that is possible to be taken. So what does this mean for medical schools? Well, there's been a long history right now of individuals who have been affected by their DACA status and or lack of DACA status. But medical schools have been in the crossroads of this. So an opportunity right now for all of us to come together as an academic medicine community and say, we are going to accept and consider DACA applicants and DACA recipients to our medical institutions. All medical schools should eliminate the practice of prioritizing or only accepting in-state DACA recipient applicants. And that's because somebody might be in a state where their schools don't accept DACA recipients and have to compete and apply at out-of-state schools. And if you're applying to a school that only accepts or prioritizes their in-state residents, then that student is at a distinct disadvantage. All medical schools should ensure wellness and support services are in place for DACA recipient students. So we know that it's not enough to simply open the doors, have folks come in for the insurance of them thriving. We got to make sure that folks who are there are well equipped to be able to work with DACA recipient students as they're navigating medical school education. And Finally, all medical schools should advocate for guaranteed opportunities for DACA recipient physicians to obtain medical licensure. This is, I think, something that I hear often. Medical schools or other state entities having some leeriness about accepting DACA recipients because they fear that their ability to obtain a medical license is something that is ambiguous, murky, or not allowed. There are a number of states that have explicitly articulated in law that there is no discrimination of licensing professions. Nevada being one of them, California being another, based on your citizenship status. Again, I think this is an inflection point for academic medicine. Seeing the tremendous impact that we saw with COVID-19, an opportunity again to activate this lever to be able to increase that physician workforce just seems like a ripe opportunity for us to be able to do it. And if we don't do it under these circumstances, it seems really, really challenging to think about what other circumstances would there need to be in order for medical schools to sort of take a stand and say, we're going to be on the right side of history here. We're going to open the doors for these deserving applicants to be considered to be matriculated to our medical schools. So with that, I'm going to pass it on over to my co-presenter, Dr. Sunny Nakai.
Thank you, Dr. Lucio. So I just want to talk a little bit about some current issues related to DACA. And so the first one is we're starting to see more students interested in health professions who don't have any form of immigration relief. So they fall into this gap where they didn't qualify for DACA or they don't meet some of the criteria. The policy, as stated, has age limitations. And so about half the students that we're working with at Pre-Health Dreamers right now don't qualify for relief. So some of the policy related to DACA recipients in medical education and health professions should also be thinking about how are we going to be inclusive of the undocumented community as a whole. There are some licensure restrictions and obviously work authorization restrictions. But I think it's important that we think about educational opportunity not as a job, but as education, right? And so for many students, when they begin their education, they don't have any form of relief. They're able to sort of figure out how to work their cases or to get resources to figure that out at the end of their training. So in California, students who qualify for Assembly Bill 540 relief and no other forms of immigration relief are eligible to receive state grants in California to attend health professions programs, even if they're not work eligible. So I think it's important to think about in including students who are undocumented in our communities. That's a really important piece of educational equity. We don't know if all the students that we're admitting are going to practice, right? We don't have a crystal ball, and so we don't withhold opportunities for students based on their ability to pay. So some of those equity principles around, for example, looking at someone's financial aid status before we admit them. We don't do that, right? There could be students who are citizens or permanent residents who have poor credit and need PLUS loans and can't get loans and can't actually finance their medical education and won't be able to matriculate because they can't get financing either. So it's one step at a time in working with these students and thinking about getting admitted, right? Preparing and getting admitted. And then we focus on the matriculation piece after. And I always tell them worst case worse, you defer and we figure out how to find that funding on the back end. It's easier to go to potential funders and say, I have a seat waiting for me. I earned a seat. Then, oh, I'm hoping I can do this. Is there any way that I can finance it, right? So the students are very familiar with the ambiguity of that process and kind of the one step at a time type pieces. If you go to phdreamers.org, if you're not familiar with that website, that is the website founded by Dr. Denise Rojas Marquez, Dr. New Ladavanscorn, and Dr. Angel Koo. Students who founded Pre-Health Dreamers in, I want to say, the mid-2000s, and I've been working with them for many years. We're launching a national community coalition to try to find more support for PhD from organizations who are interested in building their capacity to be DACA-friendly institutions. We're also continuing to move forward to release guides. So every year we release a guide for residency programs considering applicants with DACA. We update it with the court decisions, with specific legal guidelines, any licensure updates. There's frequently asked questions like, can DACA recipients train at the VA? Yes. Can they get DEA licenses? Yes. And so we put all those things in to make it easy for program directors to find answers to their questions. We've started creating guides for physical therapy, for dentistry, for counseling psychology, other health professions that our students are going into, to continue to make it easier for them to also find residency programs in their respective disciplines and get access to training. So if your institution is interested in joining, I think there's 3 levels. I want to say 3,000, 5,000, 7,000, and there are also individual memberships available. So they have trainings, Undocu Ally trainings that Yadi Ortiz, who's the executive director, puts on. The trainings also are there are panels included for current students who are members of Pre-Health Dreamers. We pay them a stipend for helping to do the panels as well. So there are a lot of projects going on with PhD that I would encourage you to get involved in and support through your institution. Let me see, I wrote some other things down. I just want to. Oh, I am still seeing and hearing from students who are matriculated in medical school who were not able to secure funding for 4 years. So some of them are still falling through the cracks of the financial aid practitioners who either are not aware, or I know at one of the schools in Chicago, students are under international students, and so their aid doesn't even come up on the radar as needing to be addressed. It's really important for equity's sake that students have a 4-year plan, a viable 4-year plan for funding at the point of matriculation. It's incredibly risky for them to potentially have to stop out or to endure the stress of either working or not knowing where their tuition, thousands of dollars of tuition money is going to come from during medical school. I talked to a student at one of the UC schools who, was $6,000-7,000 short of being able to pay their spring tuition, and just kind of wondering where that's going to come from, and is also still, doing medical school and doing well academically. That's a lot of stress for students to be under. So I think the equity portion of that experience is a lot of schools have said, oh, sure, we'll consider DACA students, and then you're kind of on your own for funding. So I think it's really important that we approach our stakeholders, and it doesn't have to be scholarships, but it does need to be equitable provision of financial aid, which means safely and securely, reliably borrow money for 4 years if your institution has loans that they're able to offer. So a lot of folks have gone to community partners and asked community partners to do loans. We at Loyola, when I was there, we structured them largely like the public service loans. So a year of service for a year of loan forgiveness based on the region, or sometimes they're specialty restricted for shortage specialties within a region. So there are creative ways to think about even converting loans or scholarships into loans if students don't match into that specific specialty or stay in that area. So there's still a big need to fill this financial aid piece. And I've been working with Don Graham and Gabby Pacheco at United We Dream to try and figure out how to create a larger fund that students can just borrow from. All we just need is a big bolus of money, and then people can just pay it back, right? Like no one's saying like, hey, just give us all this money because we think we should go to school for free. They just need to be able to borrow money the way that all of our US medical students do in order to focus on school for those 4 years. So I think there's a lot happening in this space that we need to kind of stay in front of. I want to point out that the plaintiff in the case that sued the Trump administration was actually new, Lada Von Scorn, who's a family medicine resident, UCSF right now, and is from Thailand. And so this, as Dr. Lucio pointed out, this affects largely students from Latin American countries and Mexico, but there's a very large community of students that this affects at all of our institutions. And I think the solidarity that the students demonstrated in coming together and organizing and creating Pre-Health Dreamers for themselves is inspiring to me to this day. Like, I just love the work that we're able to do together and creating those safe spaces. If you know any pre-med students who are undocumented, please refer them to PhD. We have programs, including a peer mentoring program called PEEP. That's like a prep program that they do. Typically, there's a retreat in person every year. We've been doing it online because of COVID. But that is a very, we call it the unicorn space, because it's a very sacred space where students who've had such similar experiences in isolation and their walk as undocumented get to meet other students and get to be themselves in the open and get to see themselves reflected back and validated. And so it's like seeing unicorns meet other unicorns, right, from all over the country. And it is magical the way that that community emboldens and empowers and really speaks to students. Denise, Dr. Rojas Marquez, Yadi Ortiz, Angela Chen, Dr. Angela Chen and I actually authored a chapter in a book called Critical Praxis for Student Affairs. And we talk about critical praxis with students in medical education and what our approaches were. And it's framed in the Paulo Freire collaboration framework. And so if it's not a very long chapter, but if you're interested in kind of begins with stories and conscientization of this issue, and then kind of talks about how we work with these students and what are those considerations. And one of them is really just honoring that autonomy, not telling stories that don't belong to you, making sure that you keep confidences as a person who's an ally in the community, but not a member of the community. What are some of those important considerations that we make in this work? And it's interesting because I'm an ally. Dr. Chen is formerly undocumented. Yadi Ortiz grew up with in a mixed status family. And then of course, Dr. Rojas Marquez is a DACA recipient and current trainee at Boston in emergency medicine. So we give sort of different perspectives of how we've come together and working with the community. And it was a fun chapter to write. And when I was approached to write the chapter, I was like, I can't write this chapter. Like I have to go, to this community and we have to do this together. And it was a really great experience to be able to put something in the literature, kind of putting your stake in the ground that like, whatever happens, like we were here, right? And there's a chapter in this book that represents the work that we were doing. So I know we're getting close to time. So if anyone has any questions for myself or Dr. Lucio, I don't know if I can see, but let me look at the chat really quick. Yeah. We're getting the mic, people.
Thank you for the presentation, both of you. And I think what's really important too is the states that have passed legislation for in-state tuition as well for our DACA recipients and undocumented, because of course we know, right, like that you have your undergraduate, all that money that you're, loans and everything else you've done. And then you go into medical school where you're worried about everything you all have been talking about. But I think, again, that piece of things, very important aspect as well. So thank you.
Yeah, and the state licensure too. We try to have a cohort of students applying for residency, and we have a little bit of a guide. We were able to get the ARS application adjusted to reflect DACA recipients, and that happened when I was at Loyola in like 2015 or 2016, because there wasn't any way for them to actually declare what their immigration status was on the ARS that was truthful. And so they're like, well, we can't change it. It takes years to change AAMC systems. And I was like, well, this is an employment application. And students have to sign at the bottom that everything on this is true. And you're not giving them a way to correctly represent their immigration status. So you're making them lie. So I think there's some liability for you here, AMC. And they were like, oh, we'll fix it. And they fixed it in 2 months.
That was brilliant. I appreciate
So,
that. And
yeah.
I did want to give a shout out to New Mexico for doing that in-state tuition in 2005.
Yes.
So it was like really,
shout out to UNM. Absolutely. So if you have students applying for residency, please connect them to Pre-Health Dreamers. We can connect them to people who've already matched, and they will tell. Denise and I have a list of where all of our GME trainees are. We don't share it for obvious reasons, but we have a list of where all of our trainees are, what they applied to, and they're happy to talk with people. Hey, I matched at PEDS here. This is where I interviewed. These were friendly states and programs, and we try and do it through these informal networks within the community. So we're happy to support any of your rising fourth years that are applying to residency that are DACA.
Thank you both for your talk. I'm curious if you have any creative recommendations for an institution who is meeting the request to accept DACA students, but had significant pushback at the systems level. And this request has been quite politicized. And so we have institutional administrative support, but our chancellor is concerned about issues with state support at the legislative level if we
Yeah.
move forward with it.
Yeah. It's never without controversy. So I think it's really about tying it to mission. It's about looking at the portion of the people in the service area or the region that the school serves that are undocumented or have, vulnerable immigration backgrounds. So I think in healthcare, especially, it just makes so much sense, to be welcoming people in who have an insight and capacity to serve those patients better. Another thing that I think is important is to be really clear about the funding. So some people really get their hackles up when they think we're just going to be letting all these people in for free, right? There's this sort of notion of freeloading. And so to be really clear that, okay, we have loan programs, these folks are also going to borrow, or they're eligible for merit scholarships, just like everyone else. Or I have a blog that's called Response to Alumni Who Oppose DACA that I wrote because I got a nasty email from some alums when we sent out we did our kind of Stritch magazine on our DACA graduates. And then I got this nasty email like, I can't believe that you're doing this and you're taking seats away from everybody else. And so I wrote a response to that alum, and our dean was like, I don't know if we're really going to publish this. And of course I had to edit it down. I had my real version, and then I had the academic version. But yeah, so that's a good way to think about it too. And just, I think that it doesn't mean what people think it means. And so this person had an Asian surname. And so I looked up their alumni profile and understood and went on the assumption that they were of Asian descent, and said the second largest group of DACA recipients training at Stritch right now are from Korea and India, right? So it's not really, where is that bias coming from? This is really all of us. Another thing that's really important is if you welcome DACA recipients, but you're not a DACA-friendly medical school or institution from soup to nuts, it's really important to include disclosures around that, right? So to say, we welcome applications from DACA recipients. At this time, we don't have funding, because some DACA recipients have their own funding. It really just depends on their background. You've met one student. I have people whose paperwork got screwed up. That's why they're not able. There's just all sorts of very different backgrounds for students. So being really clear and transparent up front about, yes, we'll consider application, we don't have funding, or we do, or you will be eligible for these scholarships, but not these ones. We don't guarantee that we can meet the cost of attendance, is really helpful in them trying to make decisions about whether or not they're going to spend their money to apply. Yeah. JP.
Sort of a Med portal submission specifically on DACA, because I think a lot of guides are great, but guides sometimes fail dissemination because people still don't feel like they have the talking points to train their colleagues. So have you already created something? Is something coming out? Or is that a project that a cohort of people can do with you?
Are you a plant in the audience? So we have a submission under review right now that some amazing students at Albany Medical College put together and did training. And so it's a slide deck for training for becoming, for accepting DACA, and sort of gives a lot of the background information that Dr. Lucio gave. And they did it at several different institutions and was effective at helping people understand the importance of it, what the parameters are, and how to be a good institution. And there's a paper coming soon about the DACA-friendly medical school. So not just considering DACA students, but what are some of the practice guidelines around, avoiding the ping pong effect is one of the sections, which I think is important, because you go to one administrator and students are really used to getting a different answer from 5 people within the same institution, right? Because people don't take the time to actually do their research and figure out sort of who has the final word on something like that. Yeah.
I was just wondering, and thank you so much for this talk, about any changes in the inroads, because I know nationally and federally there is money between the National Health Corps scholarship and as well as the U.S. military services to pay for 4 years of medical education. But I know, when I applied for the National Health Corps Scholar, there was a U.S. citizenship stipulation. So is there any type of changes in those application, requirements in those two, because they're always asking for people to serve in areas that are highly needed? Yeah, that would be a really important continued point of advocacy. Right now, National Health Service Corps, military scholarships, and NIH are all U.S. citizen or permanent resident required. Yeah. So we Cesar Montelongo, who's an MD PhD student at Loyola, they're not an MSTP.
They're just a institutionally funded MD PhD program. So we do sometimes encourage our recipients to apply to MD PhD programs, or if they're MSTPs that are supplemented by the institution and they can provide funding for them outside of what comes from NIH, that's another possibility as well. And unfortunately, you know, I have a chapter in my book on, you know, for DACA recipients to kind of talk with them about how might their journey be a little bit different? What are some of the considerations for preparation? And unfortunately, they often get held to a higher admission standard than their counterparts because institutions feel that the risk is just very high and there's a big spotlight on them. And if we take one and then this student fails, you know, so there is that kind of overarching challenge, you know, for undocumented students to have to meet a much higher, and at Loyola, their metrics were always higher. The pool was phenomenal. I mean, we had our pick of all the talent because we were one of the first schools in to really, you know, offer consideration for students. So.
Thank you. I was just going to add something to the question about the political pushback. So in my state of Arizona, our medical schools, our state medical schools do not accept DACA recipients. And what we're trying to do, we're sort of multi-pronged approach, working with our medical students who've really been drivers, but we also have a statewide consortium of all the medical schools, so allopathic and osteopathic medical schools, to really you know, put together a concerted front, you know, in support of this issue. But the political realities of your local state, your local legislators, you know, really is important. And so understanding what the barriers are, their specific objections, you know, really important. But there are power in numbers, and you know, just having some of the opportunities and abilities to kind of navigate within the system too, really important. But yeah, a common challenge, you know, I've seen and heard from folks, especially in states that are a little bit more conservative.